Funding for this program is provided by. Additional funding provided by.
We turn to Aristotle after examining theories, modern theories of justice, that tried to detach considerations of justice and rights from questions of moral desert and virtue. Aristotle disagrees with Kant and Rawls. Aristotle argues that justice is a matter of giving people what they deserve. And the central idea of Aristotle's theory of justice is that in reasoning about justice and rights, we have unavoidably to reason about the purpose or the end or the telos of social practices and institutions. Yes, justice requires giving equal things to equal persons, but the question immediately arises in any debate about justice, equal in what respect? And Aristotle says we need to fill in the answer to that question by looking to the characteristic end or the essential nature or the purpose of the thing we're distributing. And so we discussed Aristotle's example of flutes, who should get the best flutes, and Aristotle's answer was the best flute players. The best flute player should get the best flute because that's a way of honoring the excellence of flute playing. It's a way of rewarding the virtue of the great flute player. What's interesting, though, and this is what we're going to explore today, is that it's not quite so easy to dispense with teleological reasoning when we're thinking about social institutions and political practices. In general, it's hard to do without teleology when we're thinking about ethics, justice, and moral argument. At least that's Aristotle's claim, and I would like to bring out the force in Aristotle's claim by considering two examples. One is an example that Aristotle spends quite a bit of time discussing, the case of politics. How should political offices and honors, how should political rule be distributed? The second example is a contemporary debate about golf and whether the Professional Golfers Association should be required to allow Casey Martin, a golfer with a disability, to ride in a golf cart. Both cases bring out a further feature of Aristotle's teleological way of thinking about justice. And that is that when we attend to the telos or the purpose, sometimes we disagree and argue about what the purpose of a social practice really consists in. And when we have those disagreements, part of what's at stake in those disagreements is not just who will get what. Not just a distributive question, but also an honorific question. What qualities, what excellences of persons will be honored? Debates about purpose and telos are often, simultaneously, debates about honor. Now let's see how that works in the case of Aristotle's account of politics. When we discuss distributive justice these days, we're mainly concerned with the distribution of income and wealth and opportunity. Aristotle took distributive justice to be mainly not about income and wealth, but about offices and honors. Who should have the right to rule? Who should be a citizen? How should political authority be distributed? Those were his questions. How did he go about answering those questions? Well, in line with his teleological account of justice, Aristotle argues that to know how political authority should be distributed, we have first to inquire into the purpose, the point, the telos, of politics. So what is politics about? And how does this help us decide who should rule? Well, for Aristotle, the answer to that question is, politics is about forming character, forming good character. It's about cultivating the virtue of citizens. It's about the good life. The end of the state, the end of the political community, he tells us in Book 3 of the Politics, is not mere life. It's not economic exchange only. It's not security only. It's realizing the good life. That's what politics is for, according to Aristotle. Now, you might worry about this. You might say, well, maybe this shows us why those modern theorists of justice and of politics are right. Because remember, for Kant and for Rawls, the point of politics is not to shape the moral character of citizens. It's not to make us good. It's to respect our freedom to choose our goods, our values, our ends, consistent with a similar liberty for others. Aristotle disagrees. Any polis which is truly so called, and is not merely one in name, must devote itself to the end of encouraging goodness. Otherwise, political association sinks into a mere alliance. Law becomes a mere covenant, a guarantor of men's rights against one another, instead of being, as it should be, a way of life such as will make the members of a polis good and just. That's Aristotle's view. A polis is not an association for residence on a common site, or for the sake of preventing mutual injustice and easing exchange, Aristotle writes. The end and purpose of a polis is the good life, and the institutions of social life are means to that end. Now, if that's the purpose of politics, of the polis, then Aristotle says we can derive from that the principles of distributive justice, the principles that tell us who should have the greatest say, who should have the greatest measure of political authority. And what's his answer to that question? Well, those who contribute the most to an association of this character, namely an association that aims at the good, should have a greater share in political rule and in the honors of the polis. And the reason is they are in a position to contribute most to what political community is essentially about. Well, so you can see the link that he draws between the principle of distribution for citizenship and political authority and the purpose of politics. But why, you'll quickly ask, why does he claim that political life, participation in politics, is somehow essential to living a good life? Why isn't it possible for people to live perfectly good lives, decent lives, moral lives, without participating in politics? Well, he gives two answers to that question. He gives a partial answer, a preliminary answer, in Book 1 of the Politics, where he tells us that only by living in a polis and participating in politics do we fully realize our nature as human beings. Human beings are by nature meant to live in a polis. Why? It's only in political life that we can actually exercise our distinctly human capacity for language, which Aristotle understands as this capacity to deliberate about right and wrong, the just and the unjust. And so Aristotle writes in Book 1 of the Politics that the polis, the political community, exists by nature and is prior to the individual. Not prior in time, but prior in its purpose. Human beings are not self-sufficient, living by themselves outside a political community. A man who is isolated, who's unable to share in the benefits of political association, or who has no need to share because he's already self-sufficient, such a person must be either a beast or a god. So we only fully realize our nature, we only fully unfold our human capacities when we exercise our faculty of language, which means when we deliberate with our fellow citizens about good and evil, right and wrong, just and the unjust. But why can we only exercise our capacity for language in political community, you might ask? Aristotle gives a second part, a fuller part of his answer in the Nicomachean